Welcome to Better Space again, where emerging space economies take the spotlight on our Space Diaries Becoming a Space Leader podcast. I'm your host, Mustafa Agbadi. Strap in tight as you are currently in the front row seat, embarking on a journey to the future of space governance, policy, and innovation.
What does it really take to shape the rules of outer space? In this episode of Space Diaries, Becoming a Space Leader, Professor Frans Professor of Space Law at the University of Nebraska, explores how space governance has evolved from international treaties to today's commercial space era.
Welcome, Professor.
Thank you. Glad to be on the show.
Thank you so much. So, Professor Van Dog, for some of our listeners who may be unfamiliar with space law, how would you define space law in today's context? And what makes it such a crucial pillar as humanity expands its presence beyond Earth?
To answer the first part of your question first, I would always take a broad approach to space law. And to me, space law is all the law, all the regulations, and even contractual issues which somehow have an important impact on space activities or space applications. Much of that is very much focused on just one application or other. So the core of international space law is a set of treaties going back to the 60s and 70s, which address all human activities in outer space. But there's a lot more to it than that. And to answer your second question, you already hinted at that. Because of the fact that space is increasingly important or even crucial to our day-to-day lives, whether we talk about telecommunications, telemedicine, Earth observation for climate change research and things like that, or even whether we talk about national security, space has become an indispensable part of our today's society, and actually much more so probably than many people down on Earth realize. And then, of course, if we agree on that statement that it's such an important issue, then it's important to have law and regulation as well. There are two roles for the law at an abstract level. On the one hand, everybody agrees that the law should promote fairness, justice, and a sense of equality between peoples and persons. And that's kind of the lofty part of what law and also space law is supposed to do. The more practical part is, however, in reality, often at least as important, and that's just establishing predictability and foreseeability. There's an incredible amount of law out there, which is not necessarily focusing on what is just and fair, but just on assuring how people will act in certain circumstances. The classical example that I give is that there's nothing more just in driving on the right-hand side of the road as compared to the left-hand side of the road. And of course, some countries have one law and some countries have the other. But you need to make a choice, because if you don't, you get chaos.
Absolutely. So you indeed mentioned the development of space law within the 60s. And I mean, as a professor of space law, can you give us an insight on what the early days of building your career in a niche area such like space was like, and what kept you committed through these decades?
Yes, well, part of the deal is, of course, that space has always exuded an attraction on the imagination of people who has never thought about the infinite size of the universe and what is going on there and what has been going on there for billions of years. And in one sense, that's behind the interest in space and law as well. My particular path into space law was a little bit accidental. I started out as a modern historian, then I started doing studies in general public international law, of which space law, certainly back in the 60s and 70s, was a part. Because back in those days, space was all about just a handful of nations, principally the United States and the then Soviet Union, who were locked in a Cold War and a space race. So it was all about states and what they were doing out there. And that's part of international law. And then as I started to become more interested in this particular field of international law, a position opened up at the Leiden Institute of Air and Space Law on the field of space law. And I moved into that position, which is more than 40 years ago right now. And as the world changed, I was able to change with it. As space became more important and space law became more important, I was able to grow with that field.
Right. I mean, with your experience over a long period of time, I would like to hear from you about how to differentiate countries that, are practically building enforceable national laws from those that store? Could you give us like practical examples, some of the signs and things we should look out for?
Yeah, well, going back again to the early days when it was just a handful of states, and again, principally the United States and Soviet Union at the time, who were undertaking space activities because they were risky, they were very expensive, they required a lot of technology, and they didn't bring much money either. There's still a joke going on in the space field that the best way to become a millionaire in the space business is to start out as a billionaire, because in many ways it is a risky business, and yes. It was even more so back in the days. But since then, a handful of developments have immensely widened the field. On the one hand, we did see areas increasingly becoming profitable. Principal or primarily that was satellite communications, which is today a $1 trillion business worldwide. But also other sectors of space are now becoming commercialized. And of course, that means that they attract private money, private investors and commercial operators and private actors and not just the states. So that's one part of the major paradigm change. And the other major paradigm change, and that goes a little bit more back to your question, is that it is no longer limited to a handful of rich developed Western countries. Today, more than half of the world's countries have some sort of a space program. It may be small, it may be marginal, it may be largely consisting of joining international satellite operations or making use of space services. But increasingly, the whole world is getting entangled. And that includes countries where probably 20 years ago, nobody would have ever thought they would become interested in space. But that is happening as of today. And that, of course, means that we still have a handful of major countries added to the United States and now Russia. Of course, we see China, India, Japan, and a handful of European countries trying to establish a primary position in space, both economically and, regrettably, in a military sense. But we also see other countries who are much more pragmatic and just focus either on the science, because the space activities can still learn us a lot about things like climate change, but also the origins of life, the origins of Earth and the Moon and things like that. And on practical issues like telecommunications. In many countries, the classical terrestrial telecommunications grid was rather poor, ill-maintained, didn't allow for international connections, wasn't trustworthy, and in many ways, operators, including, for example, many operators across all of Africa, have now jumped to the possibility to use direct access to satellites for their communication purposes. And when I say communications, it's not just talking back and forth to someone. It is sending files, it is doing financial business, it's making transactions and things like that. So the array of activities that states are interested in has become much more dispersed and much more varied.
Right. You mentioned Africa, and when we were doing our research before this podcast, we came across your article that you wrote about the Nigerian NASDRA Act and the draft regulation on licensing and supervision. So would like you to tell us just a little bit about that, and how can legal framework help bridge the gap between ambition and actionable progress?
Yeah, no, that's a very important question. I think it's one of the ones that has sort of been on the top of my priority list to do research in and to educate on.
Yes.
First of all, I should take a little bit of a step back when we go back to the treaties of the 60s and 70s. Because they were all about states, there was no real mention of any private actor. So whatever the treaties provided by way of international legal obligations, it was all addressed to states. Simply because the idea that a private company would try to make money in doing something in outer space was not on the horizon. When that changed over the decades, of course, the major question arose: how are we going to make sure that also those private operators who are not mentioned in the treaties are still going to be held to the rules and principles that are expounded there? Because you don't want the private sector to make a mess out of space just because they have not been formally subjected to obligations by those treaties. The principal tool to do that is by way of national legislation. To go a little bit more into depth, if you allow me, the most important treaty is the 1967 Outerspace Treaty, which includes two articles, Article 6 and 7, which provides that states are responsible and liable also for what their private sector does in outer space, and are thereby strongly urged to make sure that any private operator operating from within their jurisdiction is sufficiently licensed. And that's where the national space law comes in. And Nigeria, after South Africa, was the first nation on the African continent who actually took the step of creating such a legislation, and which basically does two things. It's two-sided approach. On the one hand, Nigeria recognizes that it might be in the interest of the country, of the economy, of the people, to allow the private sector to do certain things, because the general ideas behind free enterprise theory is, of course, that the private sector can do things smarter, cheaper, more efficient, etc., etc. And as a society, it would be good if you could profit from that. So on the one hand, you want to allow those operators, you want to stimulate those operators, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you are in a certain level of control of what they're doing, because as I said before, in this case Nigeria, would be responsible and liable if any operator from Nigeria would cause major damage in outer space or would do activities which go against the international law. So the national law serves as a tool both to stimulate and to control the private sector. If you talk to the private sector, most of them may be, in particular in the United States, may be inclined to say, well, we only see the controlling side. We don't want government to tell us what to do because we know much better than they what we can do. But I think that's an unfair statement, because being protected by the national law and having a license can be of major value also for an operator in the global operations, because it makes you into a trustworthy operator, not a cowboy or an idiot. You apparently have been given an operating license by your own country, which means that you must be a bona fide operator, at least in theory. So that sort of gives you a general overview of why countries, once they have come to the conclusion that in principle the contributions of the private sector to space activities and to their national economy and the welfare of their peoples would be a good thing, and not everybody agrees. I mean, that's of course a principle political approach, but if you agree to that, then it would be a good thing to adopt a law on this area, because that way you can both stimulate them where you want to stimulate them and control them where you want to control them and where you need to control them.
Right. You know, it's quite fascinating you mentioned private sector in space, because there was a report carried out by Space Capital that estimated currently we have about 2,200 space startups globally, and these startups are backed with about $347.9 billion in private investment since 2009, which is altogether about 78% of the space economy. Professor Van Dok, in your view, how can international space law evolve to effectively regulate the paid commercialization without stifling innovation in space? How do you think we can go about that?
Well, as an international lawyer, an international space lawyer, my first initial answer would be the ideal solution would of course be treaties. In international law, treaties are the closest thing to what we know in national jurisdictions as laws and statutes, at least in the civil law countries, whereby you have a clear black letter law which tells people what they can do and what they cannot do, under what circumstances, under what conditions they can undertake certain activities, what the penalties are if they fail to comply with the rules, what the liabilities are, etc. etc. So on the international level, a treaty from a theoretical law professor perspective would be the ideal solution. The unfortunate thing is, of course, that today we live in an era where it is not really likely, given the large political tensions which also play out in outer space, that the major countries will be able to agree on rules of the road. One stroke of luck that we had in the 60s and 70s, that the United States and the Soviet Union at the time, who were the only space powers, the only real space powers, were able to agree on a set of rules which they both considered in their own interest. And that resulted in this handful of treaties. But now we have a multipolar world. Instead of the Soviet Union, we have Russia, which is acting quite aggressively in the international field. China has made its advances and is basically the third superpower in outer space as of today, and has its own interests. And then apart from that, we have Japan and the European Space Agency combining, and the European Union combining the major European powers, who are more focused on commercial and civil operations and less perhaps so on military domination and security. But it all plays into each other, right? I mean, there's hardly any space activity, even if it's for completely peaceful purposes, which could not be quite easily turned into an aggressive military operation. And that is one of the problems in space. So, to cut a long story short, unfortunately, I don't think that we can expect any treaties in the short run which are going to be able to regulate the behavior of the private sector on an international plane. So it all evolves down again to individual countries using their national space law to keep their private sector, in a decent shape, as well as at a decent level of law-abiding operations. Those states happen to be less regardful of international law, then clearly we run the risk that they will try to provide the same type of discretion to act even beyond the law or in violation of the law that we sometimes see happening, and that's not a good thing, clearly.
Right. You've often said that space law is no longer just about outer space. Could you elaborate on how space law now intersects with cyber, environmental, and even human rights law?
Yeah, well, human rights law is probably the most complex one, or the most futuristic one, I should perhaps say. Because human rights, of course, deal with how humans treat other humans. And when we talk about human rights in outer space, we have not yet have 1,000 people ever traveling into outer space, and that was usually for very short periods of time, a couple of weeks at most, unless you talk about the handful of astronauts who stayed up to a year and a half, which is the single stay record on the International Space Station. So in terms of human presence in outer space, the experience that humanity has is so far very limited. Those who have flown, certainly the ones who have been out there longer, are highly trained and selected astronauts, and cosmonauts and taikonauts. It doesn't mean that they can sometimes be subject to human frailties and start doing things which we would consider violation of human rights, but it's not really an urgent problem right now. That will probably only change when we see massive influx of humans into outer space, if we will ever see that. The other areas you mentioned, however, are much more important because, again, space is not only about space. Space is very much about Earth, which means that most of the space technologies are used for achieving something on Earth. And those can be very benign purposes, such as communication, such as telemedicine, or creating a better understanding of the environment, controlling pollution, prosecuting those who violate human rights on Earth, because from space you can see mass graves and things like that. But space technology obviously can also be used for very maligned purposes, for undertaking aggressive activities, for killing people, for following them, for violating their privacies, etc., etc. So in that respect, it is very important to realize that we shouldn't see satellites as their own world, but that indeed cyber rules apply or should be made to apply to the cyber technologies used for space operations. I hope the listener can understand the intricacies of once you start to deal with satellite operations largely by way of computerized systems, cyber control stations and things like that.
So there's also been a growing call for clear boundaries between airspace and outer space. In your view, what should be the role of legal scholars, institutions in advancing a global consensus on these long debated delimitations?
Well, I've always personally held that it's a good thing that you have a boundary, or that you will have a boundary at some point, because I think it's inevitable for a clear understanding. It's not an accident that in the law of the sea, where for ages we have discussed horizontal boundaries in a two-dimensional context, we have ultimately agreed on a maximum of 12 miles offshore or for the territorial waters. And then there are some other zones we don't need to go into detail right now. So I think for the understanding of how far the legal powers of a state reach, it is important to establish a boundary. If you know that when you're flying at 80 kilometers altitude over a country, you're still technically, legally within the airspace of that country, then it's clear that the rules of that country as to what you are able to do at that altitude above that country do apply. If by contrast 80 kilometers would already be in outer space because the boundary would be at 50 kilometers or at 70 kilometers, you would have to accept that that is a free area where the underlying state can do nothing. And in order to avoid misunderstandings, I think as a lawyer, and certainly from a theoretical perspective, it is a good thing to have a boundary. So personally, I've been pushing for that within my limited role as an advisor or as an academic, where I do see some convergence on an altitude of 100 kilometers. And of course, that's debatable. It's discretionary. It may be sort of an accidental altitude. But I think that we need to establish a boundary sooner or later, and I do see that more and more states on an individual level actually try to do that.
So, Professor Van Donk, if you could go back 58 years from now, just before the Outerspace Treaty was open for signature, what's one clause or principle you would most urgently want to rewrite or expand? And could you tell us why?
With the wisdom of hindsight, and I need to stress that will be Article 9. Article 9 states that states are required to only exercise their best, their good intentions to try and do their best to not pollute, to not contaminate outer space. And if the operation of one state in outer space would cause a threat of harmful interference, serious harmful interference with the activity of another state, the only obligation which is there is to consult. I say with the wisdom in hindsight, because back in the days, the whole issue of pollution, environmental pollution, let alone sustainability, was not on the political agenda. So we really can't blame the framers of the Outer Space Treaty too much. And we're talking about 1967. Since the whole idea that Earth is a valuable but also a very, very vulnerable piece to live in, germinated only a year later, when in 1968 Apollo 8 circled the moon. There was this iconic photograph taken by William Anders, one of the astronauts of the Apollo 8, of Earthrise, where you see above a bleak moon, which is pretty close, in the distance, in the total black of outer space, you see this bluish, whitish marble. And that picture, that iconic picture, has for the first time generated a sense of consciousness on Earth that we live on a very vulnerable planet, that we should be careful. And in that sense, it is the embryo, if you will, the nucleus of the whole development towards discussion of environmentally sustainable operations and sustainability as such. And that was 1968, so 1 year after the Outer Space Treaty. So now that we do have a serious problem, not just with the environmental pollution on Earth, but also with the pollution in outer space, all the space junk that is circulating there, I would love to go back to 1966 and try to convince the drafters of the Outer Space Treaty. Article 9 should be much stronger. It should prohibit the wanton creation of space debris in outer space, except under certain limited legitimate circumstances, things like self-defense or stuff like that. And there should be a kind of a duty to clear out your own mess in outer space if something went inadvertently wrong. Because that would be the ideal set of rules that we would need today if you really want to do something about space pollution.
Right. So thank you so much, Professor Van Donk. It's time for our orbital round, where we ask you a set of quick questions to get some powerful insights from you. So the first question we have for you is, what's the biggest legal challenge posed by private lunar missions today?
The biggest legal threat by private lunar mission is that they may ignore the little bit that Article 9 provides. If you are a private operator, your principal aim is basically money, at least in the mid to longer run. You might be willing to take a loss for a few years, but ultimately you're in it for the money. And everything that added additional costs upon your operations, that's something that the private sector don't like. So if they are not going to be forced, partly because Article 9 of the Outer Space Treaty, which I discussed at length before, is not very strong in trying to do something about it, the risk is there that private operations on the moon will spoil the moon, will create a big mess, will lead to a lot of destruction and contamination. And let's not forget that the moon is not just a natural satellite of Earth, but it plays a major role in many religious and other beliefs. There's almost no philosophy about why we are on Earth which does not to some extent take into consideration that there's something like the moon. And these benefits, these values of the moon threaten to be lost if we do not quickly arrive at a set of fundamental principles on how to behave decently on the moon for private sector operators.
Right. So what role should non-space actors play in shaping space governance?
That's an interesting question. The idea of governance is, of course, to go beyond the mere formalities of institutionalized international law. We have, of course, a classical legal system whereby international law is generally something that the states come up with together, including in intergovernmental organizations such as the United Nations. At the same time, it's been clear over the last half century, also in outer space, that civil society, the non-governmental sector, has become much more important. In many ways, that's a good thing, but in many ways, it also poses major risks. And I think there is still an overriding role for the governments to make sure that the private sector doesn't act only in their own limited private interests. So if we talk about the governance of outer space in the future, I think governments should listen to the private sector, should listen to their valid and legitimate concerns about bureaucracy, about being obstructed in developing new technologies if they might be very beneficial to humanity. But at the same time, there has to be some sort of governmental control. I believe that the role of the private sector should be limited to some extent. In addition, we should also have non-commercial private civil society being engaged in those discussions. For example, to go back to the previous question, when we talk about the real value of the moon, which cannot just be expressed in the dollars worth of minerals and water that might be found.
So should the concept of common heritage of mankind be updated for today's space economy?
That's an interesting question as well. Now, we should realize that there was already an effort made some 50 years ago to update the concept of the common heritage of mankind. The way it was originally framed in the 1980s, in particular in the law of the sea, it amounted to a system of global sharing of technology and benefits that those who actually were able and willing to invest didn't want to see happening. Their argument was, well, if we invest the billions of dollars and if we take the risks that something goes wrong and that everything is lost, then why should we share the benefits with other parties who didn't contribute a penny and who were not at risk at all? So because of that discussion back in the 1980s, there have been some efforts to sort of change the originally quite substantial socialist view of the common heritage of mankind and the global sharing to a mixed approach whereby we do agree that there is a common interest of all of humanity in outer space which supersedes the interests of particular countries or particular private money-making operations, but at the same time should allow for those operations if they are bona fide, if they comply with the law, and should allow for them, and then also means that you allow them to make a profit and that you're not going to tell them to share that profit with others, because I think that doesn't work. So whether you call that a common heritage of mankind is perhaps a question of language. I prefer to use the term global commons, because that, to me, it's not a strictly legal term, certainly not in outer space, but to me that expresses the combination of an area which does not belong to anyone in particular, not to a single state, let alone not to a private operator, which belongs to all of humanity together, an ownership which is then mainly channeled through the legal concepts of states, who should, however, then act together in the interest of all humanity. And while that should not include, again, bona fide private operators to make a profit, it should control all the excesses that might otherwise happen in terms of environmental pollution or unfair sharing of the resources in outer space, etc., etc. How we translate all these general principles into a specific law is yet another question, but that would be my long answer to your short question.
So our next question is, which space law development has surprised you the most throughout your career and why?
That's an interesting question. Well, There are a couple of them, but the one that comes to mind right now, and I'm actually positively surprised by that, is the fact that, going back to an earlier point we discussed, that there are an increasing amount of states that actually have a national space legislation in place or are in the process of developing one. And they're not just the traditional spacefaring countries or the traditional rich ones. We've seen countries in the Arab world, and as a consultant, I happen to have been part of that process, who establish a law now, have now a law in place or almost in place, whereby they can do this general thing that a national space law is supposed to do. We've seen in Africa countries getting more interested in that. We've seen in South America and the eastern part of Asia countries interested in doing that. And some of them are quite small. So the general acknowledgement that national law is an important tool to try and keep space as safe and clean as possible, which is certainly not totally safe and totally clean, but we can still do a lot to keep it relatively safe and relatively clean, and that national space law have a major role to play in that. I think that was a positively surprising development, because originally when I started these discussions like 3 decades ago, the general feeling was that is, national space law is only something for a handful of rich countries. The United States would be an obvious one. Perhaps countries like the UK, Germany and France had traditional free enterprise, Western rich democracies who had a major space program. That made a lot of sense. But countries like the United Arab Emirates, Nigeria, South Africa, that was something that I didn't see coming.
So our last question now is for young lawyers who are fascinated about going into the field of space. What advice would you give them looking at space law into this context?
It's two different types of advices. If you feel you do not just want to limit yourself to the legal field, I would hugely advise you to combine developing expertise in the space law field, following some sort of high-level space law program like the one we have in Nebraska. In addition to that, take some courses in orbital mechanics, engineering, and science, so that you have at least a basic understanding of the non-legal parts of how satellites orbit and what the basic mechanics of that are. I'm not a scientist, I'm not an engineer, but through my consultancy, I have often worked with a lot of engineers and commercial people and scientists, and I've learned at least the basics of what satellites can do and cannot do. And I have the feeling that makes my legal research and education so much more relevant and to the point. So try to combine space law with something like space technology or space science or engineering or something like that. If you are really thinking that law is all you want to do, then combine it with other legal disciplines. And we briefly spoke about that before in terms of cyber law and telecommunications law. But if for example, you're looking for a career as a lawyer in this telecommunications world, the space communications world, next to space law in a narrow sense of the word, the treaties and some of the other stuff going on, it's very important that you are completely aware of what the role that the ITU plays in the context of space activities, and the role that since a couple of decades the World Trade Organization plays in the context of commercial satellite operations. So combine space law with a particular other field, telecommunications law, intellectual property rights law, business law, or if you are very much driven by your concerns about sustainability and the environment, combine space law with environmental law and sustainability law and public international law in general.
Right, so thank you so much, and that brings us to the end of this episode. Before you go, Professor Van Donk, if some of our listeners would like to enroll at the Nebraska University for space law, how can they go about it? And if we have private sectors that are looking at consulting with you at Black Hole BV, how can they also go about doing that?
Well, the easy answer is in both cases, go to the website, the University of Nebraska link, and if you type in space, cyber and national security law, you will be directed to the page where that program, which combines space, cyber and national security law, obviously, is indicated. There are also emails email addresses whereby you can contact our executive director of the program, Ms. Lauren Bidelic, to get more specific information, what level of program you want to perform. So the information, at least initially, should all be on the website. And when it comes to consultancy, Black Holes has a website as well, black-holes.eu, and if you go to that website, you can also find my business email address, but you can also see an array of the activities, the consultancy activities that I've undertaken over the last quarter of a century. So that gives you a nice idea of where I could maybe help you.
All right. So before you go, we have a tradition here at the Space Diaries Becoming a Space Leader podcast, where our previous guest, who was Professor Sherif Sadiq, the CEO of Egyptian Space Agency, left a question for you. And his question is simple. He said, what are your expectations for space technology evolution in the next 5 years?
I have to be careful there because I'm just a lawyer and not a technical guy. But I think we will see a lot of development. I think maybe an explosion of technological development is a good word. That has to do with the convergence of a number of areas where suddenly the private sector is investing billions. We're talking about human spaceflight and space mining in particular. The richest guy in the world at this moment is someone who is heavily invested on space, who even has some idealistic ideas about where he thinks it should go with space. So the amounts of money in the private sector that are poured into space are staggering, and obviously they will quickly lead to technological breakthroughs. And the other angle, the other factor, is unfortunately the increasing geopolitical competition. As I said before, there is almost no space activity which could not also be used for military or even aggressive purposes. That's what we call dual use. And in today's era where the international security is increasingly becoming at risk, I mentioned before, there's of course huge tensions between the United States and China, between Europe and Russia and other parties, which may well evolve into further military conflicts than are already taking place. And that means that the governments concerned are obviously also now suddenly investing much more, maybe not suddenly, but gradually investing much more into space technology because they see that as a crucial part of the national security. And investing in space technology for military purposes then may also have a lot of spin-off in the civil side. So again, for those two reasons, I do see a lot of technological explosions. Which ones they are, I have no idea. If I wouldn't be sitting here, I guess.
Thank you so much. So thank you for tuning into the Space Diaries Becoming a Space Leader podcast. Don't forget to subscribe and follow Better Space Limited for more conversations shaping the future of emerging space economies. Thank you.